Thank you everyone for coming today. We really appreciate it. All the attention and all the hard work from the judges and all the teams who participated. So we'll be presenting the Borealis Blueprint, a proposal for unlocking natural capital by Verdant strategies. This is our team.
I'm Sophia.
I'm Alejandro.
I'm Jamie. And I'm Lily.
So first of all, we'll walk you through what the case proposes and the challenges, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with by now. The trade-offs that we'll try to solve, and then we'll move on with Sophie, who will look at how to address Finland's forestry issues. Then Jamie will talk about our portfolio architecture, as well as how BWF can position itself as a biodiversity leader. And then we'll finish off with Lynn talking about implementation and impacts on Finland. Firstly, it is critical to mention that over 18% of global exports for Finland come from forestry industry, and the whole sector accounts for over 3.7% of total GDP. And this is really important when we think about the fact that since 2021, the forest business has become a net carbon emitter. They're releasing about 2 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere per year. And this is mainly due to intensified logging, lower biodiversity, which has led to soil degradation, as well as monoculture plantations. And all of this goes against the long-term view of the EU and the UN when it comes to regulation and lawmaking for 2030 and 2035. And lastly, this just creates a problem for stranded asset management and diversification geographically. So the key trade-offs that we'll try to address from a forestry perspective, first are the rapid carbon sequestration versus biodiversity, then logging yields versus future forest resilience. And then from the financial aspect, we'll look at domestic concentration versus global biodiversification, and traditional assets versus market-based restoration. Our solution is the Borealis Blueprint. So on the right, you'll see a high-level proposal of our portfolio allocation. And our key objectives that we're going to try to solve is to address Finland's forestry and biodiversity risk, as well as position BWF as a global biodiversity leader. And we'll be doing that through 2 methods, the first of which is to embed nature as productive capital, and the second is to analyze our investments through a 3D lens of risk, return, and natural and ecological impact.
So, in order to turn Finland's environmental vulnerability into a new sovereign advantage, we calculated that a 16% yield cut would be needed in order to achieve native restoration, which would include ecological diversification over monoculture plantations, as well as longer growth cycles that can combine ecological and economic productivity in order to restore the carbon sink. In order to achieve these resolutions, we created a mechanism through 3 streams. Firstly, we'll look at our existing investments in green infrastructure, ensuring that they accelerate us towards meeting our net zero targets. Secondly, we'll look at screening our forestry assets to ensure that we don't have any unsustainable holdings without any timber value. And thirdly, we'll establish a natural asset company, or NAC. The NAC will transform long-term ecological liabilities into a new investable regenerative asset class. So, to dive deeper into the NAC, for context, around 60% of Finland's forests are owned by small-scale family operations. 10% is owned by corporations, and the rest is managed by the state. Our proposition is the Borealis NAC. It's built on Finland's existing Metso and Helmi programs that served as a proof of concept and foundation for our program design and implementation. Secondly, we aligned our program with the EU biodiversity and net zero goals. Funded by 500 million euro seed, this would be the world's first sovereign-backed natural asset company. In order to explain more about the NAC, how it would work is first, we would transfer the management rights of the land, not the ownership, to the NAC. As the global natural resources are quickly depleting, the intrinsic value of the land would only continue to increase. With this increasing intrinsic value, we aim to turn this into natural capital. We would gain returns through 3 streams: carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and sustainable timber with a premium pricing. In essence, this would transform our portfolio to focus more on transforming Finland's net emission status, investing into Finland's restoration of forests as well as peatlands, and creating this new investable asset class with active returns. And I'd also like to note that this 500 million seed in the allocation, although is a modest amount of the portfolio, its national impact would have huge, widespread impact.
Now, beyond this national solution, we acknowledge that in order for the Borealis Wealth Fund to be a robust and resilient portfolio, that they need to position themselves as a global biodiversity and innovation leader. Now, this is because at the moment, biodiversity and natural capital finance markets are kind of where carbon markets were at about a decade ago. They are looking promising, but are still quite fragmented and immature, with limited deal flow and lots of uncertainty around measurement and credible frameworks in order, which is limiting the market from scaling. And so our solution to address these key market frictions was to translate some frameworks from a recent report from the World Economic Forum, where they detail finance solutions for nature into kind of 3 key actions that we suggest the fund to take. So the first one is that the fund should take the first mover position in developing market prototypes in order to position Finland as a testbed for scalable biodiversity finance. So that includes the NAC that we just spoke to, along with biodiversity-linked bonds and other instruments. The second key piece is that the fund needs to lead in being transparent, and that's through mainstreaming biodiversity across the portfolio. This will ensure they have reputational resilience, along with that they're staying ahead of any global emerging regulations. And then the third key piece is that the Borealis Wealth Fund needs to extend Finnish leadership, and that'll be through co-investments along with open data collaboration in order to really build global credibility and have influence in the market and shaping standards as it evolves. And so I hope that between what I've kind of just addressed in terms of the need for them to take biodiversity leadership, as well as how Sophie explained we're going to de-risk forestry, we see the underpinning of our Borealis blueprint and how together these 2 objectives ensure capital resilience. Taking a bit closer look at our portfolio, we like to use the analogy of the Borealis Wealth Fund being like a forest. It first needs to have a diversified and strong and stable root system, and so that's our allocations of global public equities, sustainably linked fixed income, cash for liquidity, as well as some of the legacy forestry and green infrastructure holdings. And then from this stable trunk, we're comfortable with making the allocations towards our natural assets sleeve, as well as biodiversity impact sleeve. Now, on the right hand of the slide here, we're addressing the domestic concentration versus global diversification trade-off. And so we suggest that the fund transitions from the 55% legacy Finnish holdings to a 27% anchor in Finland. And that's because we believe through our 2 innovation arms that the fund is able to do more with less at home.
And this is our implementation timeline. We first begin by realigning the legacy portfolio to biodiversity screen allocations. And from that, it fits into the NAC pilot, expanding its impact. And from 2030, we aim to become ahead of market regulations. And from 2035 onwards, we established the Borealis Wealth Fund as a standard setter for Finland's ecological and financial stability. Here is a visual concept of our transition from the legacy portfolio to the our proposed portfolio. On the left-hand side, as you can see, the legacy of portfolio, although diversified in asset class, with generating high financial returns, but yet lacked in biodiversity impact. In contrary, our proposed portfolio, by taking into account each asset class taking into account biodiversity impact, has moved the fund upward, with our NAC sitting on the top right corner of the chart, a sweet spot of the portfolio, demonstrating high impact and aligning with the Borealis Wealth Fund dual mandate. And this transition of ours has enabled the Borealis Growth Fund from becoming a passive investor to an active steward in Finland's ecological and financial future. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for the presentation. We'd like to now ask questions from the judges' side. If you have any, please raise your hand. So we start off with Caroline.
Are these okay. Congratulations on the presentation, and thank you for the hard work. On this slide, could you share a bit of background as to how you're gaining financial returns from the different asset classes? It seems that at times we're investing in similar asset classes, like, for instance, fixed income, and we're able to drive additional financial return from the same asset class simply by investing in impact. Could you share your view on that?
I can touch on that a bit more, yeah. So when looking first at the legacy portfolio, it had an existing average annual return of 6.5%. And in the beginning, we made like small allocations or small adjustments to these allocations to include the biodiversity in each of the assets. And so from our projections, we would expect that to be more of like 7% baseline return just from that like trunk and roots assets basically. And then we would be seeing like an extra 1 to 2% premium once the natural capital sleeve and like more impact investments fully mature.
And then what's the expected return on the NAC?
Yeah. Again, the NAC is like a first instrument of its kind, so there is nothing really for us to have a baseline for. But based on forestry expected returns, we kind of brought that into our assumptions underlying the NAC. And so we have an expected return at full maturity, so in that more like 2035 plus mature stage of 8.5% for the natural asset company.
Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you to Verdant Strategies for putting forward this proposal. If we were to go back to slide 6, you're proposing a portfolio distribution on the right side of the slide that takes its root on the discussion that you just had with Caroline. Perhaps could you speak a bit more about the analytical process that led to that asset allocation? So how you went about proposing this as a first step, but also share with us your insight as to how you see the portfolio evolving over the next few years, considering that you'll be reducing exposure to forestry.
I'll take you a bit through the process of like the allocation through each like asset specifically. We kind of went asset by asset class, thinking like as we went through each one, thinking of the different trade-offs and how we can use our different allocations to kind of address separate ones. And so starting off with global public equities, just to give a baseline of for our like true core of our equities and fixed income, we wanted that to be super diversified away from any Finnish specific risk. And so we based this on the Norwegian global pension or government pension fund global and their allocations in terms of their geographic allocations as our benchmark, as their mission is to diversify away from Norway specific risk, and so we would take the same approach just with Finland. And kind of initially, we're just looking to reframe or reallocate the equities to this geographic allocation, keeping in mind like a bit of an exclusion framework for biodiversity. And then as the market matures, then we would be looking more towards including more like rigorous frameworks similar to how current biodiversity impact funds go about that. And then you can stop me if you don't want me to go deeper into anything else, but if you continue. For, go back to fixed income. As far as fixed income goes, we were gonna again base it off of the Norwegian pension fund. based on their geographic diversification. And then as well, we wanted to incorporate a tool that was suggested in the World Economic Forum report, which is biodiversity linked bonds. And so that would be something we'd look to expand to as, again, the market grows.
Well, I think. Well, perhaps just a follow-on question, a quick one. On slide 6, that explains very well the rationale and the benchmark for each different asset class that you will put into the portfolio. But the weight that is allocated within the portfolio distribution to each of those, so let's say natural capital being 7, cash being 5, PE being 3. So how did you go about allocating this weight into the portfolio to each asset classes? Did you use a quantitative method, or did you went more with a qualitative approach?
Definitely more with a qualitative approach for ours. We first piece was looking at the legacy portfolio, and we can't make huge giant transitions, and that was a big part of it, that we didn't want to switch any allocations too much. And so that's why we wanted to keep most of the infrastructure and forestry assets, just reducing forestry a little bit, and then reducing a bit of the public equity allocation as well, and just wanted to kind of free up that capital to put into more of our impact initiatives.
Thank you. I believe Leslie, sorry.
Thanks for that presentation. Yeah, lots of deep work that you've put into that. How would you propose tracking the success of alignment of this portfolio with the dual mandate? So both the financial performance aspect and biodiversity. Have you thought about which metrics you'd use?
Yeah. Do you want to? Okay. So maybe talking about the metrics more, we kind of split it into 3 sections. Firstly, by systematic screening to map out the exposure of where we would be focusing our restoration on. Secondly, looking at the biodiversity of how we would measure how the biodiversity is actually actively being restored within that area through 2 indexes, the Shannon Index for species richness and the Biodiversity Intact Index for species abundance. And then on top of that, to measure our kind of financial side to issue carbon credits. Then we're looking at the carbon pricing, which we benchmarked to the Temasek, which priced it at $65 right now, but with an increasing price for carbon dioxide to 2030 of $100. So it was kind of 3 layers in that stage. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything to add. I hope that answered your question.
Maybe a follow-up on that is, what would you say, the current pricing of something that's similar to this, or that's maybe identical, that is maybe a reference point for
the NAC?
Yeah.
Do you have any metrics for the NAC from?
We can just give you a bit of a foundation on why we're kind of confident in that Finland is the right place to establish an NAC, and give a bit of background. They do have existing programs, as we mentioned, like the Helmi, Metso, and biodiversity programs, and they already have a lot of metrics and data and everything in terms of screening areas as to where they should target first for restoration. And so we would use a lot of the existing data KPIs and such that each of these programs use, and kind of incorporate that under the NAC, and that would be what they would use.
But more from a expected return perspective, how do you value the investment? How do you say, hey, we're going to achieve a certain investment return through it?
That's would be through kind of the revenue streams that it would through carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and then
sustainable timber premium pricing.
And do you have a little bit more? I guess carbon is an active market, but biodiversity you mentioned is not.
Yeah.
How does that look in practice, in your perspective?
Maybe I was looking at, like, I think yesterday in the talk it was also mentioned the ecological accounting, that it is based on very historical data. That's why it doesn't really function well as a carbon or biodiversity metric, whereas our data is based on the National Research Institute for Finland, LUK, and maybe, yeah. Yeah, the first one, where we would be getting our information from, because as Jamie mentioned, with Metso and Helmi, these programs already do exist in Finland, except they don't have financial returns because they are a voluntary-based program. They're not sustainable. They all have an end date because they can't sustain themselves for the long term. Like, to see the long-term returns of the biodiversity and environmental impact. So we're kind of using that framework to achieve this biodiversity impact while also gaining returns through the credits of biodiversity, carbon, and then the sustainable timber premium pricing, which we got from a 16% yield cut, and Alejandro can go into more detail for that if needed as well. I hope that answers it.
Maybe one final stab at that. The NAC is kind of like an equity structure, in essence, and so whenever it does start to see these revenue streams coming through, then we would be able to value the company and the returns from there. But that was part of the key point of that the Borealis Wealth Fund really needs to take a leadership position in order to encourage more firms undertaking similar initiatives in the space to have a baseline for what expected returns would be.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Stefan General.
Open that, or it's working? Okay, good. Thanks a lot. Very interesting. Maybe a follow-up comment on the NAC portfolio, and maybe I didn't get it right. So let me know if you're mentioning that your initial allocation would be 500 million. Your target in your portfolio seems to be at 7%. So have you modeled or phased how you're going there, and how you're going to be able to deploy that capital? How long it's going to take to put the capital at work, so you're getting the revenue from that allocation, and by the time that you're not there, what you do with the allocation?
Just to start on where we're getting, I guess, the initial seed from, is we're drawing down a bit on what the cash reserves were from 10% to 5%, and so that frees up the initial allocation for us to make the seed investment from there. And that would be kind of the initial stage, as we said in our timeline. After about, I believe it's the 2 years, we kind of want to align first the core of the portfolio to our desired allocations, and then really put the work into the NAC for the 10 years up until 2035.
I guess my question is, do you think that you're going to be able to deploy the full 7% into the NAC, into the market right away, or how long it's going to take you?
Yeah, so the 5% will go right away into the Finnish domestic one, and then the other 2%, that is kind of allocations for global other emerging global NACs, kind of that we're going to be encouraging, hey, we have this seed that we're willing to invest if people start on similar projects.
We have time for one more question. Caroline.
Thank you again. And you guys have done a ton of work on the, on the ask with respect to biodiversity. But coming back to the other part of the mandate that's more financial, what do you consider the main investment risk in your current proposal, and kind of headwinds that you risk facing with respect to meeting the investment objective?
Yeah, I think sorry, me again. Can we go to the that one? Yeah. I think in terms of headwinds, like the biggest ones obviously are that the natural asset company isn't able to scale within the timeline that we said, as well as that we might not find investments suitable kind of for either the global natural asset allocation or for our more like impact, biodiversity, private equity type ones. And within our model, if we set even both of those to 0, we still have a baseline like return of around 6 to 7%, and that's just through the global diversification that we've done through the global equities as well as sustainably linked fixed income, and then the existing forestry and green infrastructure assets. So those kind of give us the baseline similar to what the legacy portfolio was of 6.5% return. Also similar to industry peers, and then we hope to see that 1 to 2% upside from the natural asset company and biodiversity finance sleeve. And again, it's all just relying on the maturity of this, and really why we emphasize that Borealis should take a leadership position and really push this market along.
Thank you.
Amazing. Well, let's give the McGill team a round of applause.